The air trembled with the hiss of acetylene torches. Sparks burst from the shadows, dancing across the steel ribs of unfinished submarines. The sound was constant, metal grinding, rivets hammering, voices lost beneath the thunder of industry. Among it all stood Edward Ted Nelson, a 36-year-old welder earning $11 a day and losing his patience by the hour. He watched men crawl through the narrow guts of a submarine, twisting their bodies just to drive a single bolt into place. Hours of sweat and bruised knuckles to attach one plank to one frame. He shook his head and muttered, "There's got to be a better way." He wasn't just complaining, he was right. What surrounded him was a monument to inefficiency, a system choking on its own tradition. The Navy wanted ships faster, yet clung to methods that belonged to another war. Below the decks, workers built miles of temporary scaffolding just to reach a few panels, then tore it all down and built it again. Every bolt, every screw, every beam was a battle against time. It was how they had built ships in 1918. Slow, dangerous, and exhausting. But 1941 was different. The world was burning, and the Pacific was on the edge of war. America couldn't afford the old way anymore. Ted Nelson wasn't an engineer, and he didn't have a college degree hanging on his wall. He was a machinist, a man who had spent 15 years learning through scars and sparks. He knew how metal breathed, how current flowed, and how a single idea could change everything, if only someone would listen. What no officer on that shipyard floor knew that day was that this quiet, frustrated welder already carried the idea that would save 50 million man-hours and rebuild the US Navy from the inside out. Founded in 1854, it was the US Navy's first base on the Pacific. 600 acres of cranes, slipways, and roaring machines, sitting just north of San Francisco. By 1941, it had become America's submarine capital, a city of steel and sweat. 12,000 civilians filled its yards, pounding rivets, grinding hulls, and racing to meet the coming storm. That number would soon explode to 50,000 as war crept closer. Among them was Ted Nelson, employee 3872. A quiet, stubborn welder who saw what no one else seemed to notice. The Navy still insisted on wooden decks. They absorbed sound, better, stayed warmer than steel, and could be repaired quickly. But installing them was an absurd ritual of wasted effort. Workers drilled hundreds of holes, inserted bolts, and built miles of temporary scaffolding, only to tear it all down again and start over. It could take 12 men a full week to finish a single submarine deck. To Nelson, it was madness. He began to imagine a different way. What if you didn't need to bolt anything at all? What if you could fasten wood directly to steel from one side only? He remembered an experimental method he'd once seen. Stud welding, using powdered flux to fuse a metal pin to steel. It worked well enough on flat surfaces, but the moment you turned the gun sideways, gravity ruined the weld. Nelson's insight was deceptively simple. Encapsulate the flux inside a tiny ceramic cap so it couldn't fall away, no matter the angle. Then design a spring-loaded welding gun that could deliver the perfect burst of heat and pressure with one pull of the trigger. Vertical, horizontal, upside down. It wouldn't matter. Each stud could be welded in a single second. No scaffolding, no bolts, no wasted days. It was beautiful in its simplicity and revolutionary in its potential. Nelson sketched the design in his notebook and presented it to his supervisors. The officers barely glanced at it. "We follow procedure," one said flatly. Another smirked. If it was that easy, someone else would have done it already. The idea was rejected, not because it didn't work, but because it came from a welder, not an engineer. Even when Nelson filed an official proposal through proper channels, the response was a polite form letter. "Your submission will be reviewed in 18 to 24 months. At that rate, the war would be over before his idea was even read. That night, Ted Nelson made a decision that would rewrite history. If the Navy wouldn't build it, he would. In the small garage behind his Vallejo cottage, he cleared a space, hauled in scrap steel, and began working in secret. His wife, Emma, worried he'd lose his job. "This will help the Navy," he told her quietly. "They just don't know it yet." For weeks, sparks lit the night as he experimented. A pistol-style handle, a spring plunger, an electric trigger, and that crucial ceramic flux cap. His key to overcoming gravity itself. By May 1941, he had it, a working prototype. And it worked flawlessly. Horizontal, vertical, overhead, each stud fused perfectly in under a second. When Nelson showed it to his fellow welders during lunch, jaws dropped. "This'll save us days," one whispered, running a hand over the smooth, flawless stud. But management still refused to listen. So Nelson quit. On June 20th, 1941, he walked out of Mare Island for good. "I'm going to build welding guns," he told his foreman. "And when the Navy comes knocking, I hope you remember this conversation." He left with $11 in his pocket and unshakable conviction in his heart. Within weeks, he registered a new company, the Nelson Specialty Welding Equipment Corporation. On July 1st, 1941, he secured a $95,000 government loan and opened a small workshop in Vallejo. The first few months were quiet. Most shipyards dismissed him as a dreamer, but a few were curious. They tried his welding gun, and the results spoke for themselves. Then came December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Overnight, America's shipyards went from busy to desperate. Every day mattered. Every hour saved meant ships in the water and lives preserved. And suddenly Ted Nelson's phone began to ring. Orders flooded in. Kaiser Shipyards bought 50 of his guns. Bethlehem Steel ordered 40. Even Mare Island, the place that had rejected him, called with an urgent request. By early 1942, Nelson's tiny factory couldn't keep up. He moved to a larger facility in San Leandro, south of Oakland. His team grew to 150 workers, producing 30 guns a day and thousands of flux-capped studs. Every major shipyard on the West Coast adopted the Nelson stud welder. The impact was staggering. Deck installations that once took 6 days could now be done in one. 3 men could do the work of 12. No scaffolding, no downtime, no wasted labor. The Navy calculated millions of man-hours saved, enough to accelerate submarine and destroyer production across the entire fleet. By late 1942, Nelson's welds were proven to be not only faster, but stronger than traditional bolts. His invention didn't just save time, it made ships more durable, more watertight, more resilient. That year, a delegation from the Bureau of Ships arrived at his factory. The same institution that had dismissed his proposal now sent officers to shake his hand. They presented Nelson with a formal citation for exceptional contribution to the war effort. The Navy, once bound by procedure, was now powered by the mind of a welder who refused to follow it. Ted Nelson had done what bureaucracy could not. He had turned frustration into innovation, and one man's rebellion into a revolution that would change shipbuilding forever. Within just 2 years, Nelson's idea reshaped naval history. Submarines, destroyers, and carriers, every one of them carried his silent signature. 20,000 tiny studs welded in seconds instead of hours. The change was revolutionary. 50 million man-hours vanished from the ledger. Shipyards that once needed 18 months to complete a vessel were now launching submarines every 11 days. In 1944, Portsmouth broke every record, 4 submarines in a single day. It wasn't luck, it was innovation. That innovation fed the entire Allied effort. The Liberty ships, slow, sturdy lifelines of war, relied on Nelson's welds to hold their decks and gun mounts. Over 2,000 were built, 3 every day, turning steel and sparks into survival. By 1945, The US Navy had grown from 7 aircraft carriers to 99, a fleet that crossed oceans, shattered empires, and ended the Pacific War. Every ship that sailed was a victory measured not in metal, but in lives saved. Every second Nelson shaved from a job was another man who'd come home. In 1943, his company received the Army-Navy E Award, a mark of excellence reserved for the best of the best. His workers, the unsung heroes of the home front, earned 2 more stars before the war was done. The Navy's report credited Nelson's process with saving the equivalent of 19,000 years of human labor. But his legacy wasn't just in numbers. It was in people. When the men went off to fight, women stepped into the yards. Rosie the Riveter became a national icon, and alongside her stood thousands of Wendy the Welders. At Mare Island alone, 9,000 women learned Nelson's technique. Their hands welding the decks of ships that carried freedom across the sea. And when the war fell silent, Nelson didn't stop. He turned his torch toward peace. Bridges, buildings, automobiles. His process shaped the post-war boom, and by 1950, he sold his company to TRW, ensuring the Nelson name would live wherever steel meets spark. Today, his invention still holds the world together in skyscrapers, highways, and ship restorations like the USS Pampanito and Battleship Texas. Even now, decades later, those same welds whisper the story of one man's determination. Ted Nelson lived long enough to see his idea change the world. When he passed in 1994 at 89, he left behind a legacy not of war, but of creation. Because sometimes, history isn't written by generals. It's welded together by people who refuse to give up. One spark, one welder, 50 million hours saved, and a war won. Not with weapons, but with will. If stories like this inspire you about the forgotten innovators who changed history from the shadows, make sure to subscribe. There are countless more untold moments like this one, waiting to be welded back into memory.